So here we have a map of drought conditions in 1934. And so I imagine I've already lost a few of you. I'm going to probably lose a few of you even more because I'm showing a map of 1934 aridity. Who cares how dry it was in 1934? Well, I think one of the things is this helps to explain some of the reasons why the Dust Bowl occurred here in this particular area of the country. We can further tie that in with the whole idea of this area quickly populating. Also, this area becoming heavily agricultural very quickly. And so we can tie in some things I just left off with. The idea of the Homestead Act causing a lot of people to move out here into these particular areas, particularly trying to turn them into agriculturally productive areas. We kind of have the recipe combined with a drought for the Dust Bowl, for a massive dust storm. And so the massive Dust Bowl, dust storm, whatever, occurred here in the Great Plains in the 1930s. And it triggered what has been occurring, for the most part, an out-migration from the Great Plains. This out-migration from the Great Plains, the western part of the breadbasket, has been occurring for a long time, and it goes back to 1934 here. And if I zoom in, I'll go ahead and kind of try to showcase where, in particular, the Dust Bowl was its most severe. But then, if we've got a bunch of dust that starts here, that then gets taken up by some warm and southerly air, now we've got a bigger problem than just a localized area in which they've got this dust problem. Now that dust problem moves throughout much of this entire Great Plains area. And so the Dust Bowl started here in the tip of Texas, top of Texas, Oklahoma, and this area, kind of the southern Great Plains. But because of the wind direction, they took all of that sediment across the Great Plains. And then when you've got a large cloud of dust that comes for several days in a row and essentially covers up everything that you own, covers up your field and everything, you're pretty much screwed. And so you're going to get out of there. So here we see the Dust Bowl then triggered a large migration and kind of a forced and mass migration that's occurred there in the 1930s. So what caused the Dust Bowl? Like I said, it was the drought conditions. Like I said, it was also more and more people coming out here. Further, people coming out here for agriculture. And we have a situation where if you remove vegetation from the surface, you remove that vegetation, essentially now what happens is that sediment, that underlying soil, is now exposed to the air above because that carpet of vegetation has been removed. And so if we heavily agriculturalize this area, we remove that carpet, that sediment now is going to be just laying there, exposed to wind, which then moves it across the surface. So over-agriculturalizing, it's a word I made up. That's fine. We over-agriculturalize this area. And so if we kind of can go back to the 1930s in the United States. 1930s United States, not our most proud time, i.e. the Great Depression. And so a lot of people were broke. A lot of people weren't putting food on their families' plates at supper time. And so a lot of people moved out here also during the Great Depression, looking to make some money, but also looking just to grow food so they could have their family survive. So you got all these people, because of the Depression, moving out, added to the Homestead Act, added to the fact we got the drought conditions in this area that prevented precipitation from forming new vegetation to kind of keep that carpet in, created the Dust Bowl, created the dust storm. And as a picture that was shown by Seth, we can see, this isn't something that's, it's a little bit of dust. This is a pretty big ordeal. So those who have served in the military in the Middle East and Iraq see these all the time. But this is a big, huge dust storm that came through and essentially wiped out everything and caused people to migrate. And so we've got the railroads that people could hop on and move along, but coming right through the most severe drought area, the most drought-stricken, the area where the Dust Bowl was its worst, was this road. This road is known as, what's that? Route 66. And so one of the most famous roads in the United States before highways were built connected Chicago to LA. And so Route 66, that was a perfect route for these people to migrate, get the hell out of there. And where did they go? They went to California. So much of California's population growth during the 1930s came from people from the Great Plains that were migrating outward because essentially all their land was nothing but dust. They over-agriculturalized it and everything eroded away. So there's a song, Okie from Muskogee. So these people are called Okies because they're from Oklahoma. And so a lot of these people, when they moved to California, the Californians referred to them as Okies. You know, maybe relating it to the 2 or 3 of you that can read. Of Mice and Men. What's the plot of Mice and Men? I've never read it.
Never. I'm going to spoil it for people.
All right. What happens is they migrate because of the Dust Bowl. Grapes of Brass. What's it about? No one read that one either? All right. Another key thing that they have here is they also have the prevalence of tornadoes. So you're thinking, why? God, Allah, Yahweh, in my case A.J. Foyt, would they have this area of the country be the one part of the world, the entire world that we live on, that they have this high a rate of tornadoes? Why is this the perfect place for the breeding of tornadoes? Why? Is because, first off, it's flat. So because it's flat, it really doesn't have anything blocking wind. It doesn't really have anything that's going to keep opposite air masses from colliding with each other. So the fact that it's flat means wind can come colliding and crushing into each other. Whereas the Rockies do a good job of kind of stopping that. So the mountains do a good job of blocking wind over here. In this case, cold, dry air coming down that way. Warm, moist air coming up that way. Nothing is blocking it. And so in weather, when you get opposite air masses colliding with each other, and those opposite air masses are about as far removed from each other as possible. When they are completely opposite, warm, hot, moist air, cold, super dry air, come in contact, that's how we get severe weather. And so severe weather, we find, of course, these fronts. I'm not going to go into the fronts and all of that, but right here, in this particular area of the country, is where we have a higher rate of tornadoes. And so the breadbasket is home to being extremely flat, but also is home to the most amount of tornadoes. Further, this tornado tracks kind of migrate throughout the year. And so actually in the summertime, up in this part of the country is where they can get some serious tornado outbreaks. And so some data shows that Minnesota actually gets more tornadoes identified than any other state in the country, which kind of is far out, because you're thinking, well, wait a minute, that's way up there. But I don't know if that's just because the people observe them or because it's such a big state or what, but tornadoes are prevalent throughout much of the breadbasket. And so, you know, people come to IUPUI and say, Andy, I want to be a marine biologist. Andy, I want to study tornadoes. I want to study hurricanes. You're in the wrong place. If you want to study tornadoes, go right here to Oklahoma. So Oklahoma State, Oklahoma, that's where a lot of the meteorologists that we see here in Indy, that's where a lot of them get their schooling from, these meteorological schools that specialize in severe weather and severe thunderstorms.
Just out of curiosity, do you know what other places around the world have tornadoes like that?
Yeah, you know, Russia gets a good amount there. China gets a few.
I know when I did my research, it said Canada was second, but it only had a tenth of what the U.S. had.
And I bet that's all those right through here. The thing is, tornadoes occur in every state, I believe. Yeah, I think tornadoes occur in every state. I'd have to dig out my notes. But anyway, I would think be somewhere similar on the other side of the world that has, at that latitude, has a bunch of wide open space.
Mongolia Plateau, maybe?
Mongolia, possibly. And so we're thinking, remember where Bow Rat's from? Can you point up to the Caspian Sea? Do you know your Caspian Sea? Yeah, right to the east of that, maybe. Might be a place where you could find some of that. But it's almost the perfect conditions. That's why we're tenfold higher than anybody else. Is the fact that we've got that super flat area, but also the Rocky Mountains do a good job of making sure that this wind gets steered up that way, making sure this wind gets kind of steered down this way, because it kind of does a good job of deflecting. So they kind of boom, right? So where they meet, that's where they take off. Anyway, tornadoes. And so they've made a career of it here, Oklahoma City. So Oklahoma City, they're called the Thunder. Out here you have a team that played last night, Iowa State Cyclones. I don't know why Tulsa's called the Hurricanes. That makes no sense at all, but anyway. So of course we can see this play out as far as pop culture. Wizard of Oz doesn't take place in Georgia. It takes place in Kansas. Where boom, we have a massive tornado that came through Greensburg, Kansas. This was about 6 years ago. It's a pretty severe sucker. So students see pretty much ooh and ah before and after pictures. There's the tornado's aftermath. Came out, just wiped out Greensburg, Kansas. This is rare for a tornado to be this big. Most tornadoes would be probably just this big as far as their devastation. This was a big sucker, about a mile and a half wide. Rarely are they that wide. But nonetheless, nature's most powerful force. All right, I'll belch it out. All right, so here's Greensburg, Kansas afterwards, and you see not only other things, we can see how freaking flat it is, but we can see how very rural, but we can also see the devastation from the tornado, from the twister. The Pristine Myth. So one of the things is, I don't know if I've mentioned this yet, but the Breadbasket said is the most altered place, most altered area by humans anywhere in the world. So nowhere else in the world has this large of an area been altered by human beings. So the idea there is this was when, before humans arrived, this is nothing but tall grass prairies, short grass prairies, a few forests here, a few forests there. That has been over time wiped out and removed all of that stuff for agriculture, for corn, for wheat, for hogs, for cattle. But others would say, you know what? We could blame westward expansion. We could blame the Homestead Act. But this whole idea that the early westward expanders across the Atlantic Ocean came across this pristine area. Christopher Columbus is the name I was trying to get out of my head. Christopher Columbus in 1492, when he came to America, this idea that it was just sitting there, was untouched, is a myth. There's no doubt that the Native Americans did a lot before we arrived that altered the landscape. So there's lots of data that shows that the Native Americans burned a good chunk of the Great Plains. They burned it for various reasons. They burned it so they could clear areas for agriculture, clear areas for other purposes, but then of course they always weren't good at keeping the fire in. So this area has been heavily influenced way before our westward expansion took hold in this area. But I go here to Canada. I'm glad you guys included stuff about Canada, especially that particular area. I can't remember what it was. Was it religion? Huh?
Talk about Wheaton, Saskatchewan.
Yeah, Wheaton, Saskatchewan. Yeah, was that what it was? Yeah. So it's nice how that bleeds up into here. But one of the things that I noticed with this map of Indian tribes, First Nations tribes, and so this new idea, which we're using the native names instead of the American name or the English names. But the thing is, we see tons of them over here in the coastline. Tons of them over here in the coastline. But very sparsely populated here in the middle. And that kind of makes sense. These are wide open areas that didn't have the amenities that you would find along the coastlines. So even the natives, who didn't have industries, who didn't have, assembly lines, were still kind of locating here in these Great Plains area, quite dispersed from each other. We also see that there, so quite nomadic. So the groups here, the Native American groups that lived historically in this area were nomadic. What that means is they weren't fixed in one spot. They were constantly on the move. And so where the buffalo went, they went. So they would follow their food sources. Very much hunters and gatherers, always on the move. I'm kind of building something up here. Today, where do we see Native Americans? Here we see them in good quantities in the Great Plains. Particularly here in Oklahoma, but the green lines with those illustrated reservations. And so you have a group that's traditionally lived in particular areas and have always kind of migrated and followed and moved around, and now kind of being forced to live in one particular area. So we see the role of a forced and mass migration in which all across the country Native Americans were kind of pushed to the least desirable areas. And so there's a perception that, as we've talked about, there's not much out here. And so where we see reservations popping up, here in the middle of nowhere in the least desirable areas. But there's also, for some Native American groups, this is sacred space in which their descendants have always lived, for example. So where do we see the Native Americans in good amounts here in the breadbasket? So I asked the question, why do we have so many more Native Americans here in the breadbasket, but so few there in New England, in the Foundry? After all, I showed the map earlier, it shows there's a ton of Native American groups. I mean, hell, what are we called? We're called Indiana. Why do we not really see much Native American presence here? Today we do over here, in the breadbasket.
Trail of Tears and other forced migrations.
So boom, one, forced migration. So the forced migration I just talked about. So that's one reason why they're here. They were forced to go here. So the forced migration, forced and mass migration to particular reservation areas. And once again, the least desirable areas. Forced migration. Two. Try to think of another forced migration. African Americans are still throughout much of the American South. Right. So forced migration doesn't always explain
Available space.
available space. First off, so where can they go? They can go where there's wide open spaces. It's also available. So you have a forced migration, also wide open spaces, maybe that are less desirable.
Well, I don't know. Could it be like a change of mindset where they're like, well, to a certain point, like, let's just kill them. We don't even really worry about them. They're Indians. And then now we're like, okay, different policies kind of came along. And
Yeah.
we should push them out.
Yeah, but I think those policies might be more temporal than geographic. I mean, it might be more of a current thing. I don't know. Anything else? This is great. Love it. Tearing up.
Could be the change in, like in Indiana, it was all forested, and those Indians lived in the forest at that point. So when we came through and developed stuff, they're like, well, we can't really live here anymore.
Yeah, maybe.
Maybe building off of that, other, you have tribes in the Great Plains like the Lakota who were less influenced by the movement of people into America because they were so much further out, so they still have their standpoint there.
Yes, I see what you're saying. So we've got this forced migration. Migration. Further, of all parts of our country, we've got our west coast, we've got our south coast, we've got Florida, we've got our east coast. Where do new migrants go to? They go to those places. They go to those places, and as they go to those places, they kind of continue to add to the population that's non-native. You've got Mexicans coming there, you've got Italians coming, you've got Germans coming, you've got British, all that. And so this area remained pretty much migration-free. So new migrants, they don't go to the Great Plains, they go instead to these other areas. And so over time, this area has kind of remained separated, very much isolated compared to the rest of the country. Further, if you're kind of forced to live in this particular area, and over time you live there, and your families have lived there, who said you're going to want to all of a sudden get the hell out of there? And so we grow up in a certain place. Why did I end up back in Indiana? Because this is home. And so for Native American groups, this is home. So they're not going to leave a particular area because this is where they're from. This is where their descendants have been. The hunters and gatherer lifestyle might be very much a big part of their tribe's history. So you get these various factors help to explain why this particular area, especially compared to New England and the Foundry, has more prevalence of Native Americans today. It's these various historical reasons and layers over time. But we got kind of a reality here. And that reality is this is not, there's definitely the haves and the have-nots in the United States, and a story that's not not told too often is the Native American story. And so we go up here to this reservation called Pine Ridge. I'm going to take you here in a minute. But Pine Ridge, let's kind of compare Pine Ridge to the U.S. average. Annual per capita income, much lower. Poverty rate, much higher. Life expectancy, much lower. Infant mortality rates, that's how many infants die out of 1,000. 18 versus 6. Liver disease, 121.3 people die of liver disease per 100,000, only 9.7 is the U.S. average. Suicides, nearly triple, or more than triple, the U.S. average. And so here, Native Americans that we see here in Pine Ridge, obviously things aren't as good as the rest of the country. So let's try to figure out what's going on here. Let's see if we can pull off multi.
work. Check, check. Check, check. Yep.
Working? So we just saw my passcode? What do I do here? Why? Anyone know what I could do?
Did turning it not, because it blinked out for a second.
Do you have your portrait?
Yeah, is your portrait thing on? Do you know how to like change that? On the actual iPad.
Switch.
On your iPad.
Double tap home button.
Oh, it's fixed. I mean, it's normal on there
Yeah,
now.
it's normal now.
Thank you to Women to be here. And so, yeah, I'm not going to go too much on that slide there, but here we've got a weird-looking religious tradition. And it's weird to us if you grow up a Christian, or if you grow up someone of a more of an organized religion, what we perceive as an organized religion. Here, animist is the belief. It's very much character. This is the only part of the country where we're going to see a large non-Christian population that we see here. And then we can see animists and spirits and all of that. But kind of just a way to showcase the poverty. So here, a family of 22 people live in this 3-bedroom house. So, you know, one of the things is, well, why do these people not move out? Well, they can't afford to. Or it's very much part of their culture to live this way. So while we think 22 people living in a 3-bedroom house is a nightmare, if that's the way you grow up, you don't really know anything different. Further, if you've never been to Avon, Indiana, or all the great metropolises there in the east or the west, you have no idea how people live. I have no idea that 2 people might live in a 3,000 square foot bedroom. But you can nonetheless see the poverty here. So this is where a girl is getting her bath here at Pine Ridge. So here's Pine Ridge youth. You can tell that the flag is upside down because they ain't happy. Why are they not happy? They're not happy because there's been a series of, over time, United States government kind of continue to divide up their land, and slowly and surely their area is becoming smaller and smaller and smaller. And so the idea is there's this handshake agreement. Okay, we get this, you get that, and then all of a sudden, 10 years down the road, the rules change. So here, these people are tired of these broken promises. They're tired of being forced to live in the least desirable area of the country. So this is why you see this dissatisfaction showed in that image there. We kind of can put the ties to what I just talked about. Here's a map of this group's area back in 1851. And so I'm going to go throughout time here, and we're going to see it slowly getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And so you can understand kind of that angst. Why they're having the upside-down American flag is, hey, they're tired of these broken policies, these broken rules, these broken agreements that can constantly change over time. And so we can see, just like any group, I mean, they've got neighbors that get along with each other, all that cool stuff there. But here we see some pretty interesting images. So poverty level, extremely low. Extremely high amount of people that are below the poverty line. And so here is just nothing but a mound of donated clothes. So they gather up all these donated clothes, and they pile as much as they can. And so they pile them up wherever they pick them up. So much that, look, that's a person that's alive. That's stuffed in there. Then they take that back to their ranch. So there's a perception there that the federal government gives Native Americans all this money. That perception is not true. In some cases it is true. But with this particular group, they're pissed off. So they say, they feel like if they accept the money from the federal government, that's them accepting the fact that their land has been shrunk down to absolutely nothing. They want that land back. And so how can they accept that money, but then get the land back as well? So they said, no way we're going to take that money. So we're very, 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 very high amount of poor people here in Pine Ridge. And so here's some graduates, part of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. But if we go over here, Here's a ceremony for a girl who committed suicide, like we showed beforehand. Suicide rates extremely high on Native American reservations. Some reasons why. I'll ask you. Some reasons why so many people kill themselves in Native American culture, but in particular Pine Ridge. Doesn't know if it says that. Why do you think? Any suicide experts?
Because they have nothing to live for, they feel like that, and there's
We're talking, I mean, look all the data I showed beforehand. There's not happy times. So anytime we see suicide rates are often correlated with income levels, education levels. So there's no doubt that that poverty, that lifestyle weighs on them. Any other reasons why? I didn't know people killed themselves until I was like 12. I never was around it. So to me, suicide was never even something that people would do and could do. But if I grew up in a family where my aunt had committed suicide, my mom thought about committing suicide, so on, you see a culture of suicide where it becomes normal and it becomes aware. So young people, they grow up aware of suicides. They grow up in a family where it becomes actually kind of a cultural part, a cultural norm, if you would say. So suicide rates here are quite high for various reasons, but also alcoholism. So high alcohol rates. And so in Pine Ridge, they actually have no alcohol. You're not allowed to buy booze in this particular reservation. So how are all these drunk guys here from Pine Ridge? They're right on the border. And so what they do is these guys, they go just to the southern border, they go into Nebraska, where along the border, liquor stores have made a killing. They're making $5 million a year by opening up these liquor stores right here along the border of this reservation. And so essentially, they're saying, we can take advantage of all these people who want to get drunk, that are right now located next to an area in which they can't get drunk. So over time, some in the reservation have tried to remove these liquor stores from nearby, but they can't do anything. They're not in their jurisdiction. So here we see a guy, he's suffering from some type of alcoholic neurologic disease. I'm going to try to make up what it is. But you can see poverty, no doubt, has left its toll there. Let's continue on. All right, so let's try to go back to the other mode. Jeez. All right, and so if we go just over here, that's not going to help me. Think about our states here. We've got Wyoming, Colorado. We've got South Dakota, so we've got South Dakota, Wyoming, Colorado, Nebraska, all kind of smushed in right there. Pine Ridge is right here. And then right over here is this thing called Devil's Tower. So we're going to try to relate some physical geography in with this as well. So Devil's Tower. How did Devil's Tower form? Here it is. So for the natives, this is very much a spiritual location. They look up at this thing that just stands out in the middle of a flat landscape. Where in the hell did this thing come from? And so where did this thing come from? It came from a bear climbing up and scratching off the sides of the Devil's Tower. Actually didn't. The bear would be pretty darn big. So what we have here is we have something called a volcanic plug. So a volcanic plug. And so we've got this underlying rock. Over time, this volcano starts to happen. So we have this lava coming and working its way up through the rock. And it's about ready to burst through the surface. However, it starts to die down. And so we have this volcano that essentially doesn't happen. This volcano, when it cools, is going to become a much different rock than the surrounding rock. So we have this huge magma-full area that's going to eventually cool and harden and become rock. Over time, we've got this sedimentary rock here. This sedimentary rock, think of it being weak and fragile. This Chuck Norris, this here is big. This is a cross-fitting piece of rock. And so this rock here is going to be able to resist the forces of nature over time. Over time, sedimentary rock is removed various wind, glacier, river processes, and reveals that plug from that volcano that didn't happen. So the Devil's Tower is essentially a volcanic plug that just never burst through the surface. And over time, all this has been removed from here, revealing this very sturdy, hard rock. All right, where the buffalo roam. So here was a very critical person for why agriculture really took off there in the Great Plains. This guy here, his name is John. I don't know if you've ever heard of John Deere, but he's very famous in the agricultural industry for his various tractors and trinkets and stuff. But John Deere, what he did was, he was the first person to actually realize the whole idea of a plow. And so beforehand, we think of this Great Plains area, this grassland, very, very tough to break and penetrate that soil. And so what he did was he invented a plow that was strong enough to actually poke through the surface and then remove that topsoil. Beforehand, this was seen as being quite impenetrable. It would be too difficult to break open that surface and open it up for agriculture. But John Deere invented the plow to do that. And so that plow helped to break the plains and to help to really open up this area for agriculture purposes. Further, another thing with the livestock. And so why did livestock, grazing, cattle, whatever, take off? The invention of barbed wire. So barbed wire, you could then put a barbed wire fence very quickly over a very large perimeter. You know, this isn't going to be a deal where you're going to have Tom Sawyer working on a fence for the entire summer. You're just going to want to put down wire around a large area. And so, of course, if a cow or grazing animal came across this barbed wire, they would learn, I'm not going to cross that barbed wire. I'm not going to go any further. If you don't believe me, go hang on a barbed wire fence after class today. And you'll see how much pain that is. And so what that did was it provided a good opportunity to keep those cattle in and those grazing animals inside an area. Then ranchers could then obviously, you know, control that much better than having these various animals roaming quite freely. Further, absolutely critical to the Great Plains was the railroad. And so beforehand, I told the stories about rivers. I told the story about how we had the coastlines. We've got these estuaries and these various bays and harbors. Now, when we think, then I talked about how cities were then built for kind of industrial purposes. Pittsburgh and Cleveland. Now I'm going to talk about why cities grew. It was very much because of the railroads. And so beforehand, the Great Plains, an area that doesn't have much rivers, doesn't have much flowing water on the surface. Boom. Key to getting those crops from the interior to a place like Chicago, to a place like Kansas City, to a place like New Orleans was the railroad. And so the railroad, kind of corresponding with transportation changes, helped to open up the Great Plains, helped to open up the breadbasket, and then bring that corn or that wheat to places in which it could then be bought and sold and distributed. Another key thing to help open up this area for agricultural purposes, especially there in the western part of the breadbasket, is drilling techniques. And so essentially what they had was people from Pennsylvania perfected how to drill down and access groundwater from below. They really initially started with mining, so creating drills to mine deeper there in Pennsylvania. And so they took that technology. We continue to be in the world's global superpower in mining technology, but they came out to the Great Plains, took that same technology, drilled down deep, and came across, wow, there's a ton of groundwater right underneath the Great Plains. And so when we think about these areas there in the west, how do they get water? How do they get water in such a dry area? They got it from underneath them. So it was actually sophisticated drilling techniques helped to bring water from essentially an underground lake that comprises much of the Great Plains, below much of the Great Plains, in which they sucked all that water out, and then of course that water then gets put onto the agricultural fields. And so in those more dry areas, areas that get less rainfall, drilling became absolutely critical to getting that water from below surface to above the surface. So this is absolutely critical. Now, where do we get this water? This blue, is essentially a massive underground lake. We call it the Ogallala Aquifer. So here we have, going across much of the western part of the Great Plains, we have a very dry area. Once again, how do they have agriculture here? How did they over-agriculturalize this area? They did it by tapping that underground water essentially right below them and bring that water, bringing it above surface. Problem with this, you have this underground cup of water. So that water is removed from that cup. Over time, though, water isn't filtering through, like a Brita, isn't filtering through back through the cup. And so what's happening is the amount of water here is depleting, and it's depleting very quickly. And so a major problem right now is the fact the Ogallala Aquifer is shrinking and nearly half the size that it once used to be. Why is that a key concern? If you're in Nebraska, your whole entire year, your whole living has been bringing up that water from underneath, bringing it to the surface. Now it's dried out. Boom. And so, of course, we're going to understand why this area has become heavily aquifered. So that water is being pumped out at a very fast rate, particularly in those areas where they try to grow a lot of corn, like we saw beforehand. All right, the rail. The rail was critical for bringing those Germans in. I thought they didn't know how much I'm going to talk about the Germans and the Scandinavians. So you guys talked about the Lutherans that came in and settled much of the Great Plains. The Germans that came in and settled much of the Great Plains. They rode the rail. The rails was critical for bringing these large immigration groups across the foundry to the breadbasket. So much of, like we've already showcased, Swedes and Norwegians and all of that. That could really be showcased here with this map, but I'm going to just go ahead and push on. All right, so we zoom in, we look at our population density map. So I'm going to try to understand why do I see a very organized pattern here, which are big clumps, they're fewer big clumps, but they're kind of spread out far from each other. But if you look at these dots to me almost look like they're perfectly spaced from each other. I mean, think about it, this is nature. Not nature, I guess it's human beings settling on an area, and it looks like a very organized pattern. This very organized pattern we can relate to the railroads. Central place theory. What's central place theory, and how can you relate this to central place theory? G110 All-Stars. The creme de la creme. All two of you. 3, 3.5, 4. How could you relate central place theory to this?
Things at a distance that's going to draw like the most people from one area to it without like I guess just like trying to get the most people to go to one point. And so like those distances were like, if you split those distances in half, the right side's going to go to the right, and the left side's going to go to that left point, because that's where they want to.
I see what you're saying.
Kind of like Walgreens and CVS's.
All right.
Has to do with goods.
Yep.
You know, like how far you're willing to go to get, like if you're a farmer, how far you're willing to go to get the food that you're not growing, or what the gas that you need, things like that.
All right, there's the nearest. These are the markets. These dots are the markets. Here's your farm. Which one of these markets are you going to choose? Once again, here's your farm. Market, 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 market. Which one are you going to choose?
The one closest to you.
The one closest to you. No doubt about it. And so essentially, people are drawn to these central places. And so think about this: the distance you're going to be willing to travel to take your crops, take your corn, to then take it to somewhere where it's going to be then bought, sold, and then taken and hauled somewhere else. You're going to go to the closest distance possible. And so over time, these bigger dots that you can kind of see here were essentially railroad towns, in which railroads came right through these towns, but then invested in each of these towns. And so they invested in them. They wanted them to grow. And so a rail line would come through there, and then over time, each of these little nodes would become bigger and become the destination for all these agricultural individuals to take to market. And so these little dots that start to pop up then become localized market areas. And then the bigger ones then become even bigger. And so then this market then takes it to the next biggest city. And so you start to see how you have this hierarchy of cities with, of course, the top dog being Chicago. And so all this relates to central place theory, simple marketing theory. But anyway. All right, so here we have a map of Iowa's counties. What do we notice about Iowa's counties?
They're like the exact same shape.
Why do you think they're the exact same shape?
Grid pattern.
Bada bing, bada boom, the township and range grid pattern. We can actually see it play out as far as counties. So each of these counties, you could probably divide them up, and they're they got the 9 little townships within them. So we can see this geometric pattern play itself out in the maps here. All right, land grant universities, there's a ton of them there. So this is critical for understanding why there's so much agriculture research from those various schools. Here's the famous groceries versus bars map. So where there's more groceries, it's gold. Where there's more bars, it's red. So we see more bars found in a good amount of the northern breadbasket. Some reasons for that: higher education levels. So the northern part has those high education levels. That makes sense from these individuals that have migrated throughout this area here. So no wonder we're going to have Lutherans throughout much of this area, very highly educated, because they all came from New England, where of course they stress education. Anyway, pushing on. Here, one of the stories about the Great Plains. Back when you're really being bored into tears back in high school, you would have learned probably about how the Great Plains was the depressing place in which no one would want to live there. Things have changed. And so April 2006 article, Not Far from Forsaken, kind of this dreary picture of these abandoned homes and kind of this landscape in which people are moving out from it. One guy suggested we should just turn all this area back to the buffalo. Just kind of get rid of all this and move away and just let the buffalo roam freely. Because there's nothing here, they argued. So there's nothing there. Dwindling heartland, America's new frontier. So all these articles in the 2000s about how the Great Plains and the breadbasket slowly deteriorating. So much that there's this school. This school was, because of no one going to school there anymore, because the population is dwindling so much, because so many of the people are moving out, they converted this school to a bar, which makes sense given the map I showed you beforehand. Alright, in many ways this hollowing out of the heartland is spawning a regional crisis. Hundreds of small towns are disappearing from the map. The lack of local jobs and the allure of cities are sucking young people out like a prairie twister. We got another key term, the brain drain. So particular rural areas, particularly the breadbasket, you see the brain drain. And the best and the brightest, they don't stick around. And so you see this. And so the best students I have, I'll put my money on the line, the best students I have aren't from suburban Indianapolis. They're from rural Indiana. Because a lot of them are valedictorians, salutatorians. And so they're top-notch at their high school. They come to IPY super prepared. I asked them, are you going to go back to middle of nowhere, Indiana? Are you going to go back to middle of nowhere, North Dakota? No way. There's no way they would go back. There's no jobs there for them, especially for someone that has high skill sets. And so in these particular areas, brain drain is a critical problem. And so what that means is a lot of the people that are left around are the old people. So in this particular area of the country, you've got a high old age dependency ratio. What that means is you've got a high number of old people compared to young people. Why is that a problem? Old people require resources. They require health care. They require various things. If you've got fewer people in your local area, fewer young people working to support those people pulling pensions, that becomes a key issue. So in these particular areas in the breadbasket, the brain drain, the loss of young people, especially to those sponge cities I've mentioned beforehand, those nearby big cities, is becoming an increasingly big problem. And this is one way to showcase this. What someone did was they asked someone in North Dakota at a high school, the blue is where they do live, the size of town where they live, going from small to big, and then the red is where they want to live. And so the blue is where they live, the red is where they want to live. You can see there's definitely that desire to live in a bigger city. So hardly any of those people who are from a small area would actually want to stay in that small area, the small towns. It's something that we see here in Indiana especially, but throughout much of this area. So declining populations has very much been the characteristic, and this is a way to showcase youth. So the age of the group that's migrating. So where it goes down is more people leaving, where it goes up or where more people are coming in. And so you can see young people, doesn't matter if it's the 50s, red line, purple line, 60s, 70s, or 80s, people have continued to leave, especially young people, people just like you, have left the Great Plains. The geography of recession. A useful map to show, because it kind of speaks to the economy here. So the economy here is much different than the rest of the country. So what this is a map that shows unemployment from the recession. So right now it's not good to be black, purple, or red, color-wise. So we'll see where we're at the end. The last place. What do you notice about the last place to really be hit by the recession? Great Plains. Any idea why? People continue to eat food. Exactly. People continue to eat wheat or drink beer. People continue to eat cheese. And so that's something that's going to be relatively stable. And so what we see here is the primary sector industry. When you have a primary sector industry dominate a particular area, they're pretty much recession-proof. They're not going to have a big boom, but they're also going to have a big bust. And so where are those places along the East Coast? If you're tied into finances, if you're tied into real estate, you were hit hard by the recession. If you own a big plot of land, and on that land you've got corn, people are going to continue to eat corn. As I showed, corn actually became increasingly in demand. Recession is essentially the last place it'll hit will be the Great Plains, in a place that's overwhelmingly dominated by the primary sector. Good example of a future question. An exam. All right. What did I tell you about the Oklahoma people? They all moved to California. Well, guess what's happening now? California people are moving to Oklahoma. So you're seeing a return migration. So Californians are moving to Oklahoma because the primary sector, so agriculture, very stable economy, recession-proof, but now it's technology. So the new thing the Great Plains is investing in high technology. And that makes sense. They already have a highly educated population. They've got all those universities there, they're there already. So here you can see the growth of the tech sector, in particular Oklahoma City, in attracting Californians there for jobs. The same idea is happening with Indianapolis. As we're starting to attract more people from California, and a lot of that's related to medical technology. So here's a map I've shown several times. So if you're poor, where are you likely to actually no longer be poor? So if you're poor, the chance of you actually making it, if making it's what we want, making it to a higher income, you're blue. If the chances of you staying poor the rest of your life are high, you're red. So we can see there's been a change here in which people actually have better chances, less income inequality in the Great Plains. But we can see the reservations pop out there. We can see the reservations pop out over here on the South Dakota. Next up, fracking. What the frack? All right. So what's happening in North Dakota is now it's seeing an increase in population. So now suddenly North Dakota is becoming the place people want to move to. We're seeing this in migration rates. So more and more people are moving to places that previously no one would want to move to. So what's happening? Why all of a sudden are people moving to middle of nowhere North Dakota? Why are they moving to middle of nowhere South Dakota, Montana? Why do we see very increasing migration rates here? Well, very simple. There's jobs there. So if you want to follow, why are places growing? Because there's jobs there. Why are places declining? Because jobs are no longer there. So that's going to be as you go through your next 10, 15 years. You're going to find places where there's jobs and places where there aren't jobs. And so right now, there's particular job growth in the middle of nowhere, North Dakota and South Dakota. It's related to the mining industry. So once again, primary sector. In this case, what's happening is they're now reaching oil, or they're tapping oil that previously was thought to be incapable of accessing. Further, that's key to that is sophisticated drilling technologies, in which now we can drill down to a certain level, and then we can drill over. Beforehand, it was just straight down, and that's it. And so now we've got the technology where we can actually go down and then over in our drilling techniques. Also, what's going on here as far as North Dakota, why is it growing? We're seeing a very large migration of people from outside this area coming there for jobs. Further, kind of just like ethanol, why is fracking, why is this becoming a high-growth area? Because people say, hey, this ain't oil from Iraq, this ain't oil from Venezuela, countries that we perceive to be terrorists, where we see that harbor terrorists. And so now it's domestic. It's from the United States, so by gosh, this is a better thing. And so these various reasons are why we're seeing this mass migration to middle of nowhere, North Dakota. All right. Pretty humbling when your career is boring people to tears. Pretty humbling. Pretty fucking humbling. All right. How fracking works. So we'll see a video here, maybe throw in some sound.
share the source of natural gas and oil. Historically, the formations have been difficult to drill. Today, it's possible with the technology of fracking. In North Dakota's Bakken Formation, fracking started in 2006. Nearly 8,000 active wells now dot the landscape. Deep underground, horizontal pipes stretch up to 2 miles long. The Iverson well, drilled in 2010, illustrates the fracking process. The well plunges nearly 2 miles down, with cement and steel casing inserted to prevent leaks into groundwater. The well curves when it reaches the Bakken, layers of shale that sandwich a layer of sandstone. The pipe follows the sandstone because that's where shale oil collects. Fracking begins by forcing plastic balls down the well.
Using
the
water.
balls open sleeves in the pipe to expose holes. Fluid is then pumped down the well under extremely high pressure. The fluid shoots
They
through
use a
the
lot of
holes
water
and
for this
fractures
process.
the rock.
Keep in mind where this
Over the course
is.
of 3
Not a
days,
water-rich area.
This well fracked the rock 29 times. The birds show where fissures were created.
So then they crack it,
Once
they get all that water, and they suck it back
fluid
up.
is released,
And now that
it
oil,
flows up the
boom,
well.
right up there.
The used fluid,
We're talking, I mean,
contains toxic
this is stuff that,
flows up with
you know,
some of the fluid is recycled.
China, we often see China as being a competitor of ours. They aren't doing this in China. This is the United States in which that innovation happens.
Effects of fracking are unknown, but in coming years, the number of wells in North Dakota is expected to jump from today's 8,000 to 50,000.
So that's why that area is actually growing. In a couple of ways I can show this. First way is, if you look at a night image, this is real. This is an image at night. Come on, come around. So you can actually see the fires from created from the fracking here at night. It's an area that's obviously extremely remote. You can actually see from space at night. So here's the fracking in process, and so these are mostly a male-dominated job. So it's very heavy lifting. So we can see that there. So these suckers here, these dudes, get paid up to $120,000 a year. So why are people moving here? Why are you willing to leave God's country, Indiana, to move to middle of nowhere, North Dakota? So they're going to be paying you $120,000 a year. So the pay is key to driving a lot of people there. Now everyone's the level of the roughnecks, the people who actually we see here. But nonetheless, you can understand why people are willing to move and migrate. There's no doubt that there's a lot of toxins released. So this here, it says down here, if a little bit of fire was sparked, this guy would be incinerated. A big, huge explosion would occur from all that toxic chemicals. So that's another key concern, is we're producing a lot of toxic chemicals to access this oil, to access this fuel. Here's a cesspool, kind of a retention pond here, which they use to store a lot of waste. Continuing on, growth in this area, once again. These are things that if we've gone here 10 years ago, this street would have been abandoned. The service stations would no longer be there. Now they've got a traffic jam problem. Here in the middle of nowhere, North Dakota, they actually have a traffic jam problem. One of the things, like I said, most of the people that are migrating here are males. So these are males from other areas. So here we can see them off duty, but this is where they live. So one of the things is because you have a large mass migration, because all of a sudden this job growth came out of nowhere, you got to find places to put these people. And so you see these temporary housing that's being used for the growth of this fracking industry for all the workers. And here they get along, they get together here. But one of the things that this doesn't really show, I think it does kind of show, is there's diversity. And then oftentimes we get diversity, especially rural males together, oftentimes where we get some tension. So there's often a lot of conflicts within these groups, especially when we get a bunch of males coming together, especially when there's no females there or at the bar. So you can understand why there's a lot of crime, a lot of violence from a bunch of men who are stuck with other men for a long period of time. Anyway, so here we see a guy that's died, so it's very common for crime, drugs, and all this from this fast, high-growth area. This here image, it's a fake gun, don't worry. But this woman here, she's being forced out of her home. So the local government is forced her out of her home to make room for all these migrants moving into work. And so you got displacement. So you got some negatives and some positives sprinkled in here. It's great. The economy is starting to thrive here. You can go to McDonald's. You can work at a McDonald's here for $60,000 a year. So right now they'll pay you $60,000 a year to move up here and work at a McDonald's. So that's $20,000 more than what I'm making sweating up here. And so here you can see more of the landscape in which you've got these fires that are produced from the fracking. That's all I got.